It's truly a pleasure to introduce this panel, or more importantly, the moderator of the panel, David Shear, who will be in charge of hopefully an almost certainly enlightening conversation about rare diseases with this very distinguished and expert panel. So with that, David Shear, please come.
Thank you, David. It's really a pleasure to be able to moderate this panel. For one thing, it's a subject that I really have spent a lot of time working in and being focused on. And secondly, as was said, this is an amazing panel. I feel actually privileged to be able to work with this group of very talented people. What we're going to try to do is not have everyone go through laborious self-bios. I think they are apparently available on, electronically. Well, let me just sort of briefly say, to my left, Lon Cardin is the CEO of Jackson Labs, and actually he brings a lot of really interesting perspective because not only does he run a truly extraordinary institution that is, I think, not as well known as it should be, but he also brings a career from the rare disease industrial perspective. So I think it's a real treat to be able to get his perspective. Nina Kjelsen from Canaan Partners. Canaan is actually a extraordinarily important name in our state with respect to venture capital, but also, I would say almost the world. And when I was introduced to her, I was really thrilled to learn that not only Canaan, but Nina herself continues to be very focused in rare disease innovation and investment. We also have Matt Klein, who is the CEO of PTC Therapeutics. I think we know he's a Yale grad because he's wearing a Yale tie today. But it turns out that, notably, and he's representing a company that has been extraordinarily successful in getting products to market in the rare disease arena. Actually, he's a reformed plastic surgeon. I think I heard his background at one point. And then, to his left is Martin Mackay. And I think, this is getting to be a little bit of a pattern because he and I think, will have done 3 panels since last October. But in each case, it's a pleasure because Martin brings for us a truly extraordinary background, having been head of research at some somewhat small organizations like Pfizer and AstraZeneca. And then he ended up at a small organization by the name of Alexion, which became a bigger organization now in the name of AstraZeneca. And of course, after that, he decided to be an entrepreneur, and he's the exec chair of Rally Bio, a rare disease company. And then finally, Michelle Spencer-Manzan brings us, first of all, someone who is a lot more legitimately a Yale person today, which is good, and someone who I think has a combination of expertise in genetics, which is such an important part of rare disease in terms of genetics and ultimately targets and treatment. But also, and of course, she'll talk a bit about, some of her activities in the state regarding rare disease, but she also is someone who can speak to some personal experiences in this space. Mm-hmm. What I wanted to do in starting off this panel today is to really give a little bit of a personal perspective as to why I been in this field for a number of years. And I will be willing to bet that each of us on this panel would probably have shared experiences. So one of my early companies some years ago had been able to develop one of the first drugs for something called homozygous familial hypercholesterol. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what it is, it's a genetically determined super high cholesterol, about 1 in a million in the US. And it turns out it's a congenital disorder. People that are afflicted with it have very high cholesterol, and they can have multiple heart attacks before their 20s. And we had a drug that actually was one of the early players in getting people to their goal. So what's the story here? The story is we had a patient who was in one of our clinical trials, and he came to the FDA advisory panel meeting, and he made the following comment. Before I was able to take this drug, every night when I went to bed, I prayed that I would wake up the next day. Every single night. And he said after being on this trial and he's watching his LDLs come down, that he felt actually a bit more at ease, that he really will wake up the next day. Yeah. And how many of us face that day in, day out as a struggle in life? I have one other anecdote which I'm going to share. And actually, I was thinking, I was preparing myself for the panel today because I've worked in the IPF space, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and I have a person I know who One day I went in, he works in a store. I'm not going to mention his last name. His name is John. I go into the store and I said, John, you look very gaunt. You really don't look very well. And he said, well, I've been told that I have fibrosis. And I said, is this IPF? And he said, yes. And I said, well, how can I help you? What are you doing? Are you getting OFEB? Are you getting Esbriet? Are you getting one of the drugs that have been approved for IVF? And he said, I can't afford it. And I have a very good friend who may not be in the room today, but he used to be the CEO of Boehringer Ingelheim. And I called him. I said, Paul, we have to do something for this person. Can we get him the drug? We did. He went on the drug. He couldn't stay on the drug because the side effects were just way too much. And this is really one of those themes that, we really need targets and we need pathways and we need approaches which can be better tolerated and be more effective. Before today, I actually sent him a text. And I said, John, how are you doing? And he said, I'm really very seriously ill. I actually brought some notes as to exactly what he said, but he said, I'm very seriously ill, and my doctors are telling me that there is nothing left for them to do for me. Mm-hmm. I don't have a lot of time left. And so that was actually just reading this note, was really something that brought me just, feeling really awful. I sent him back a text and I said, I'm really sorry to hear this, John, but, this may not help you, but there's a lot of research that's underway in IPF. And it's one of those things where maybe timing isn't perfect, but I will say one thing to you, that your case and you as a person inspire me. And this is absolutely the God's honest truth. And many of my meetings that I do when I'm working with groups trying to sort of develop drugs including IPF, I'm working on something with IPF now, I bring him to this story. I bring him to the meeting because I think what we have to do as people who are working in a field like this is to humanize essentially what we're dealing with as sort of the problems these people face. And I said to him, you are inspiring other people, and we're going to continue to fight and hopefully reach some sort of solution. Mm. So that's really a theme I wanted to launch us with. And again, I would bet every single one of these people on this panel will have had some similar experiences. But keep in mind that I think for various reasons, each of these people are heroes in a field where there's such unmet need and where people and the patients, their families are suffering from these disorders. So what I thought I would do is actually start with Lon to my left, part of what I think is so important, and again for you being here, would be to tell us a little bit about what it's like to be in a lab like the Jackson Lab and running it, where most of us at some point in our careers thought that there are only a bunch of mice there, and little do we know that this is a lab which is actually populated by researchers working only on humans, and remarkably, so much of your research is translatable into the rare disease space.
Yeah. Well, thanks, David, and thanks for including me in this panel. I'm really, really delighted to be here. To set the context for the Jackson Lab, I've been on a career mission since the 1990s. 2 chapters in a mission. One, can we find the genes that cause human disease? And can we do something with the information? That's it. I'm still at it. I'm not going to give up at it. In chapter 1, the field has been phenomenally successful. Since the 2000s, we have thousands and thousands of loci for common and rare diseases. For the chapter 2, not so much. And we haven't been able to convert that at all. So my trajectory took me from academia to try and find genes into big pharma to try and do something with that information. And that was all in human genetics. Finally into rare diseases at a really great rare disease company called BioMarin in the Bay Area. And now I've never dealt with mice in my life, and I find myself running the oldest mouse institution in the world, which the board is still wondering about their decision-making process there. So the Jackson Lab's been around for 100 years. We basically invented the use of laboratory mice to study human diseases 100 years ago for genetics research. two areas that the lab has been most, virtually every university or healthcare system will use mice from the Jackson lab, but two areas where it's been most impactful are cancer and in rare diseases. We've been running the short course from with Hopkins, Johns Hopkins, Victor McCusick, who was the founder of rare diseases, for 65 years. So the training comes out of the Jackson lab. It's one of our board members calls it the most impactful research institute that nobody's ever heard of. Because we enable others to make discoveries rather than doing a lot of that ourselves. And I think we can do more. And that's why I came to the Jackson lab. I think one of the bottlenecks in rare disease translation is that very early stage of understanding, can I move this target enough to make a difference? And I think we can do better at that. And that's what I came to the Jackson lab to do.
If I may, so Nina Shelton, I've been a venture investor for about 23 years. And my very first investment was in a rare disease company called Espriva that was taking a common drug and legitimizing its rare disease applications, taking a transplant medicine that Roche had and bringing that into pemphigus, lupus nephritis, and to myasthenia gravis. But my most recent investment is also in rare disease at Canaan, a company called Actio Biosciences, where we've discovered some rare disease gene targets and are developing small molecules to them, and then looking to see extensibility of those sort of phenotypes to more common diseases. But to Lon's point, we're collaborating very closely with Jackson Labs, and specifically with Jackson Labs, because one of the real bottlenecks is that so often disease models for rare disease have been brought up in small academic labs and very preciously made by really capable, fine-tuned academic hands, but are difficult to transfer to another lab and to make many of these mice so we can repeat test our molecules. And we're working to do not only replicable models, but really deep phenotyping to understand those conditions with Jackson Labs, because they are absolutely the preeminent company in this space.
You know, this conversation is really so critical because, you know, investors like Nina really need the reason to believe that, you know, some of the science can be translatable into products. And we are fraught with, I think, unfortunately, we're fraught with many disorders, diseases, what have you, where there are relatively poorly translatable models. And to some extent, you know, it is really just incredibly important that people like the researchers at Jackson Labs and others, of course, around the world are developing models that can be better validated and ultimately be more useful in terms of really advancing, in the nearer term, catalyzing capital formation, but in the longer term, really being able to sort of position for appropriate clinical development and you know, market access. So this is really just such an important area. Shifting a little bit to Matt. So again, you've had an interesting pivot in your career. Tell us why and how you chose to move from being a professor of plastic surgery to being a biotech CEO, and a little bit about what does success look like. And it must have been very easy for you, I'm sure, to get to the point where you are.
Straight line.
It's a straighter line than you might think. So I proudly wear the Yale medical tie, where I got my start doing research in the skin bank and burn center at Yale back in the 90s. And I developed a very strong interest in doing burn surgery and reconstructive burn surgery. So trained as a plastic surgeon at Stanford, then did a fellowship in acute and reconstructive burn care at the University of Washington, where I joined the faculty, shifted my research from basic science to clinical research and translational research, and had a full-on academic career as a professor of surgery and public health, endowed chair for surgery, federally funded, ran the residency program, all of that, and taking care of what really is a rare disease, which is burn injury, in fact. And as a reconstructive plastic surgeon, I took care of people throughout their life, and you really see this as a chronic rare disease, and had the opportunity to connect with a CEO for whom I had done some consulting when I was a resident at Stanford, who was starting a biotech company focused in rare disease. I started consulting, going there once a month, once every 3 weeks, once every other week. And then when I was taking FDA calls between surgeries, I said, I can't do both, and decided to try it and ended up staying. But there are a lot of really important lessons that I took from my clinical career. not only in terms of patient care, but running an intensive care unit with burn patients and having to learn to make life and death decisions on limited data, lead a team of multidisciplinary folks who have their own perspective and having to integrate that together, learning how to work under a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and lead people through uncertain times when the outcome may not be great or the outcome's uncertain. And having a strategy and making sure there's tactics subordinated to that strategy and knowing when you have to change course and not being afraid to do that. And those are all the essential things you do when you're running a company, and particularly a company in rare disease, where I think one of the keys to success is you yourself being incredibly passionate and mission focused and making sure that you have a team that remains mission focused, because it's incredibly challenging, and you need to be determined. There's lots of ups. There's also lots of downs. The old saying that it's amazing how many overnight success stories take 25 years. Well, that's rare disease. Nothing happens quickly. And when you're trying to do something important, which developing drugs for patients with rare disorders is incredibly important, and it's never been done before, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. There's not a blueprint. There's not a path to follow. You're going to have to create that. And pioneers take arrows. And the journey of a pioneer is riddled with failures that you have to turn into learning lessons. And that's what we do in rare disease. And so I think the keys to success are having a good plan, obviously, having drugs that are effective. I think the other saying is great drugs make great companies. It's not the other way around. But you have to have a good plan, a rational plan, be patient, be willing to know that there's going to be successes and failures and be able to bounce back well, incorporate learnings and keep going. And of course, like anything else, you probably also need a lot of luck along the way and for a number of different things that can arise.
So I'd like to ask Michelle to actually weigh in on what is the role of genetics in this whole equation. And I remember when I was working in the HoFH space, there was this not so unusual debate about prevalence and detecting cases in the population, and there's literally wide error bars on how many people there are in a particular disease, and then of course there's the issue of how do you find them, and then ultimately treat them. So maybe if you could give us a sense of what that role of genetics is and how you are involved perhaps as well in translating some of the basic genetics and clinical genetics, and how that is used in the path to developing drugs.
Thank you. So genetics. So first I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. I'm very excited to see so many people here, and thank you for having me. The majority of rare diseases do have a genetic basis. And so probably all rare diseases have a genetic basis. Geneticists deal with kind of one, at this point anyways, one gene, one set of kind of predictable phenotype. So we have kind of at this point been at the forefront of the rare disease discussion, because we can, and particularly if you're talking about drug development, when you can find a genetic disorder, you can then go to a lot of things everybody here on this panel has. What is the mechanism? How do we attack that mechanism? How do we look at treatments? The clinical geneticist, I think, is kind of in the center of that, collaborating with our, other clinical colleagues to manage. A lot of these are multi-systems. Your genes are expressed in every cell of your body. For some genes, they have one thing that only affect the brain, one the heart. Many of them affect multiple systems. So you're working with different providers, but you're also working with your basic scientists and your translational scientists. And then you have people who do more kind of clinical trial works, and we're working as a team. I think that's one thing. Rare disease requires a village, it requires a team, and our role is to be at the center of that. First, we need to find the patients, and I think this idea that rare disease is ultra rare is not true. And there's two things why each individual rare disease is rare. Rare disease as a group is not, right? And I think that's something that up to 5 to 10% of pediatric patients who have illnesses have a rare disease. And we are finding more and more even in the adult community. And there's a couple places we're finding that. And we're even finding incidences are higher. So one of the beautiful things about is when we get treatment, we get things on newborn screens. So we start identifying babies at birth. And so one that makes a huge difference in how their outcomes are. The earlier you treat, the better they do. But many diseases we thought were one in 10,000. When we start doing newborn screen, we realize, no, they're 1 in 1,000. They're much more common. And we're making real impacts on that. So this is where genetics is. And we're just talking about this. So I've been on call I'm on day 14 of being on call. And I'm amazed actually just how many, we're getting from adult and from pediatrics and from all over. We're getting many more consults because people are realizing that this thing that's growing here is developing, and that knowing makes a difference in how you treat people, and we're getting novel therapies. And our novel therapies are not only impacting and improving the lives of our rare disease patients, and I think that's another piece. Rare disease oftentimes informs common disease, because I'm going to go back and say everything is genetic. So even if it's not a single gene, there's genetic components. So, even things like I'll take the medications we use to lower the ammonia in rare urea cycle disorders is now being used by the hepatology teams for liver patients. So you went from a drug that was being used by 100 people to a drug now that's being used by 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people. So that there is a lot of applicability, and actually understanding both sides of this is helpful. So I kind of see the role of geneticists. One is getting the diagnosis, helping people kind of understand and translate it, because, these reports are complicated and the pathways are complicated. So we are probably more basic scientists than I would say the average kind of academic physician. But we also, we're also taking care of the patients, explaining to them and working with our colleagues to find treatments, because a lot of these still don't have treatments. And I think with that, we're going to make meaningful impact.
I think there are a couple of things I think to amplify in your beautiful remarks. I think one of them is that rare disease so much in our lexicon has been defined by the legislative definition of orphan rare disease, which is the 1 in 10,000 in the U.S. or fewer than 200,000. But in fact, it's probably about 30 million people in the U.S. that have a rare disease. So it's actually an enormous population to be addressed, sliced into a variety of different diagnoses. And the other point that you said is about the basic science and genetics. It's thanks to genetics that so many rare diseases, 6,000 or 7,000, have been de-orphaned in the last 10 years. And the basic science and funding basic science at places like Yale is so important to continue to drive those understandings.
Yeah, and actually, I think funding comes from various sources, of course, from the NIH and some from the capital markets, and actually in that context, I wanted to direct a question to Martin. And normally when I ask him a question, it's going to be somewhat formulaic, like what was it like to be a big pharma R&D director, or what was it like to be a R&D director at like a smaller pharma like Alexion. But I really want to do a little bit of a pivot, and maybe, and that is ask you a question that maybe is even more important than, I know you and I had this conversation, in our pre-call. And that is, are we doing as much as an industry to define how difficult things are to get accomplished, but ultimately what successes we can achieve in the rare disease arena? And the corollary of that is, with all of the cost and all of the payment for failures as well as successes, can we do a better job of explaining why the drugs in the rare disease arena cost so much?
So a very simple question, David. Thank you. Really make a great double act here, pricing, especially in my role at Rally Bio, but being on the board of Novo Nordisk is coming for some scrutiny at the moment. I'll take half a step back, David, and say, having worked in the biggest pharmaceutical company and then a startup that Steve, who's in the audience, and I started in my dining room, the smallest you could imagine, there's many more similarities than differences, actually. And the biggest similarity is people are highly motivated to do the right thing and come up with great medicines. Our scientists at Pfizer, at AstraZeneca, Alexion, Rally Bio are all highly motivated to come up with great medicines. I've never saw any difference there. Actually, the degrees of innovation across these companies didn't differ too much either. I've told you this before, we did our first gene therapy deal in 1995. pretty innovative, and we're, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies. So I think that is, was the same. Timelines are about the same. Can't see much difference between them. And so there are many more similarities. Some of the differences, and then I'll come on to pricing, are quite easy to understand. One is it does cost more in big companies, and it's just because we had to do so many other things. When you're in a big company, one of my former companies, I would joke with the CFO that we had more people in finance than we did in research. It was just a fact of life that they had to do that. The differences, a couple of differences, cost I've mentioned. The other one was the proximity to patients. And I think it's why many of us who have moved into rare diseases have stayed there, because genuinely we just have more proximity to the actual human being that has the condition. When we opened the Alexion building on 100 College Street, instead of having the usual dignitaries and that, we invited 5 extended families. Of the 5 families, they had a member with either paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria or atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome or hyperphosphatasia. It was such a different profile. And because it was rare diseases, we knew those individuals so intimately and so well. When it comes to pricing specifically, David, what we found during that time is if you go to either a payer, generally in the United States, or governments in Europe or in other geographies, if you had a medicine that was genuinely against a devastating disease, and it was genuinely transformative, and it was a small number of patients, people were willing to pay for that. And they were willing to pay for it because it made this difference. And when I talk about transformation, I mean the difference often between life and death, or not a normal life and a normal life. So the fact that we could go to these bodies and just lay our claim with data, real patient data, made a huge difference. And in those days, people were prepared to pay for that. Where companies, I think, have got into some difficulty is when it isn't transformational. It's an incremental benefit, which is important. Our whole industry has been predicated on incremental benefits. But if you go to people with budgets that are trying to pay for this, we got short shrift. So my message on the pricing front, David, is make sure that what you're coming up with is truly transformative, that the conditions are devastating, and then people will be willing to pay. Does that make sense?
It does. And I want to shift to Nina, because to some extent, the lifeblood for many innovator companies, including my own, are represented by the venture capital community. And of course, I think we've heard from some of the sessions today, which I didn't attend deliberately, that it's a tough market out there. Sort of know it. But can you give me a sense of how you see the investment climate for rare disease investment? And actually, I just want to play one little anecdote for you, which is essentially a venture capital colleague of yours who will be nameless, who basically said to me not long ago, investing in rare disease is really difficult because given where things are and the number of potential acquirers that are left, and given the fact that as a result you need to forward integrate and commercialize, I find that to be a less attractive category to invest in. Can you respond to that?
I think it's a fair comment, and I mean I can certainly add to the headwinds for investing. So the enumeration there is, I think, in general for rare disease, because we are typically first in class and pioneers, I think was the word that Lon used, or Matt used. We have to prove that those patients are out there, that we can find them, that we're making a difference, and so we're taking it to launch to prove market access, and that you're getting reimbursement. So that's a longer horizon. The BioMarins and the Ultragenyxes of the world have grown up to say we want to invest in products that are not ultra rare anymore, but rare. The Alexions and Genzymes were acquired and integrated into large pharma companies, and so their strategies are more speculative. And then you've also had some regulatory and policy issues. The Orphan Drug Act reauthorization faced a lot of pressure as to whether or not there's going to be as much of a tax credit. In fact, it was taken from 75% to 50%. under the Inflation Reduction Act. We also face the pressure of a single indication for orphan drug designation having protection against the price negotiations coming in 2026. So there's a lot, and there's a lot of debate with the FDA reauthorization too about whether the accelerated drug approval pathway was going to remain. And these things, these regulatory benefits are kind of a lifeblood when you're looking at first-in-class indications that often take a little bit longer to develop because you're doing things like natural history studies to show exactly what is the life cycle of a patient's journey with a condition or a disease. So a lot of reasons why people might say this is a tough space. Fewer acquires, you have to take things longer, you have perhaps some threats to the regulatory space. But perhaps also in the Inflation Reduction Act, there is a pressure against small molecules. And so those of us who are thinking that might be more patient-friendly, more suitable for pediatric, a lot of rare diseases are childhood onset and so forth. But perversely, under the IRA, there's also been some benefit. People started looking and saying, hey, targeted oncology is really tough for small molecules, and maybe orphan drug becomes a defensive play there. And so some pharmas that weren't in rare disease are now looking at rare disease partnering. Some public investors have seen some really nice appreciation in the public markets in rare disease companies. And Biogen with its SMA product had a really nice tear, and a lot of people saw that as a positive beacon. And then if you think about it, we were talking about the challenges of a small market in rare disease, maybe making it tough to make a good return on investment. But historically, it takes about 7 years for a rare disease patient to get a definitive diagnosis. And they've typically seen 17 specialists by the time they get that definitive diagnosis. So the cost to the healthcare system, I just wanted to amplify and add to what Martin was saying about why can you charge a lot for a rare disease product. It's not just because any given health plan has so few patients, and for them it becomes a rounding error if they have one of these 5,000 or 10,000 rare patients. It's also because there's a lot of net savings to the system if you can find that patient early and make a dramatic change in their healthcare utilization and the supportive care that they need. So there's a financial imperative to do it, and that's the case that we try to make. And then I would say the patient advocacy and patient engagement makes it easier to find those patients once you begin. They are incredibly motivated to partner with industry to drive patients. And then the last point I would just say is we invest at Canaan with an eye towards, can we build something that pharma will buy? And that will buy at a level or a value that gives us a return that makes sense for our fund. And the median exit value for rare disease companies is absolutely on par with the exit values of other therapeutic categories. So it's a good business case. It might take a little bit longer, so we look for where can we get an edge on the timeline, but it makes a really nice return. And I could list the names of the companies, but even in the last couple of years, there's been a dozen really nice exits as well as some really good IPOs.
Even one of mine in 2020 that Martin's company bought, but.
I'm chomping at the bit here. All those headwinds are real. Let me give you the biological counter to all of that. I would posit now there's never been a more opportune time to invest in rare disease.
I'm super
right
excited
now.
as well.
Right now is the time. And 3 reasons that I can see. One, the early stage biology, it's never been more informative than it has before. We have these great animal models. We have iPSCs and cellular models and organoids that we can screen on, and we're getting fuel to link all this together by AI in a way that we never thought of before. So the early stage probability of success is higher than it's ever been and just going to go north from there. There's one. 2, we've got modalities that we haven't had before. We've got gene therapies now, we've got editing, we've got antisense, much more than the small molecule. So we can get these things to places that we never were able to get them before. And third, and Michelle hit on this one, I think, and so did David, many paths lead for common diseases go through the rare angle. So your familial hypercholesterolemia story, which led to statins,
Yes.
is no longer alone. And those are becoming more and more frequent all the time. Epilepsies are looking that way. Heart failure is looking that way. In fact, even some of the dementias are looking in this direction. And we should have known that it was really going to break into component pieces. Look at breast cancer. 50 years ago, we started the war on cancer, and we defined it by breast cancer. We have 80 different drugs for breast cancer now for individual components. It's not a single disease.
And these targets, this is exactly the premise of Actio Biosciences, the company that we are collaborating together. We have targets, ion channel targets as distinct as TRPV4 and another working in neuropathy and skeletal dysplasias that will have applicability in organs and systems so distal from those, but the same exact chemical scaffold could, or in the case of our regulatory morass, we probably have to find another molecule so that we can have distinct indications. And similarly, we have a neonatal epilepsy, and that will have extensibility to other epilepsies as well.
So Matt, you're jumping in the bed.
Yeah, I was going to say there's two other really important changes that I think make this an ideal time for rare disease. One is there is now a culture of rare disease drug development that I think has matured over the past decade.
Yes.
So that things like natural history studies, patient foundations, and academic groups interested in rare diseases are doing the natural history work that we need for drug development. That wasn't there 10 years ago. As one example. The other is regulatory bodies. There is now, I think, more flexibility in both the FDA and European Medicines Agency for rare diseases that never existed before. I would say 10, 15 years ago, you would often have, the regulators looked at rare disease through the prism of large disease and didn't understand the diseases, so said, okay, if you have a rare eye disease, we don't understand it, so we're going to judge you as if it's glaucoma. Well, it couldn't be more different in the number of patients, endpoints, all of that has really evolved. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than it's been. Even this morning, news came out, Peter Marks, who's the head of the biologics division at FDA, is talking about a platform approach to biologics and gene therapies. How can we leverage one approval to accelerate a second approval if it's built on the same gene therapy backbone? That's a phenomenal advance.
Absolutely, and FDA and NIH are collaborating on natural histories as well.
Yeah, and all that is, that I think probably also from an investment standpoint, right?
Absolutely.
The biggest question is, great, you got a great idea. Is this thing ever going to get approved? Because it's not going to get approved. You're never going to sell it and no one's going to buy it. And so I think that's really made this an exciting time.
So Martin, I hope you're going to tell us that, I was just loading the answer, but you're going to tell us that rare disease gives you a faster, less capital-intensive track to get to clinical proof of concept. Is that true?
Yes, but what I wanted to say was...
And that money raising is easy.
Yes, and the funding raising is very easy. You can clearly see we have a like-minded panel here. So I'll try and be a little contentious, David.
Good.
And direct, just a quick question to Nina, but also I'd be really interested in your view, but as a clinical geneticist. Our lead program, which is for the prevention of fetal and neonatal alloimmune thrombocytopenia, with prevention being a really important word. Just very briefly, the disease is the mom's well, the fetus as well. There's an immunological mismatch similar to rhesus disease of the newborn or hemolytic disease of the newborn, which causes a problem. So we're coming forward with a prevention. The mother goes on healthy, the fetus goes on healthy, very like Winrow and Rogam that I've said. Now, I should declare that Kanan was a founder investor in our company, so clearly we've been able to raise money. I think it's fair to say, as we've gone to not just investors, but broader population, this notion of prevention isn't firmly in people's minds. And certainly all my career was treatment, right, up until this time, essentially, apart from a little vaccine work. So Nina, I would ask this maybe more contentious question. What do you feel about that as an investor, i.e. trying to prevent a disease? And Michelle, from your perspective.
Well, I think
Was that directed to Michelle or to Nina?
Nina first
Okay.
as an investor and then as a clinical geneticist.
Well, I'll take the typical VC's answer and say it depends. And I think it depends heavily on the severity, the significance of the risk, the probability of that event occurring, and the severity of that event if it occurs. And I think those conversations are intermediated by medical geneticists, obstetricians, and the conversation with that expectant mother about to deliver. And I would note that those conversations are still woefully inadequate, in part because people like Michelle don't always get to be at the bedside and in that conversation. And there are far too few Michelles, because we have, I think, one medical geneticist per 200 population in this country, and half as many genetic counselors. So maybe it's the reverse. We are not prepared to have these conversations. But I think to invest in something that is preventative, that has real power. For example, if you knew you had ApoE and had a high predisposition for early onset Alzheimer's, and you had a gene editing therapy that had been through phase 3 trial, I don't think that would be difficult to market. Certainly wouldn't to be to anyone who had a family member who was affected. So I think it's context dependent. I certainly would make that bet all week long.
Yeah.
Michelle, do you have?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with a little bit of a story, since I think I'm the only person here who hasn't told the story yet. So I had a little 6-year-old girl I saw 5-6 years ago now, horribly spastic. She had looked like kind of a spastic cerebral palsy, seizures, developmental delay. The family had recently immigrated from Syria. I had the story, mom said she was completely normal until she actually got, the family's house got hit, was in the blast radius of a bomb. She got hit back, hit her head. Everybody, she'd been told for a long time this is what it was. So we did the workup, and she was very severely affected. I'd not seen, we certainly see patients like this, but I was, of course, looking for, I think some things have been brought. I was looking for a channelopathy. I was looking for, neurotransmitter disorder, because she had this terrible intractable seizures, et cetera. So we did the workup and we did the metabolic screen, because she hadn't had a newborn screen, and she had PKU. Okay. Had that child been born. So she has a sister about a year and a half later. Sister, of course, we knew was coming. Sister gets newborn screen. We do testing. Sister's diagnosed at birth. So we, with treatment, that 6-year-old became less spastic. She started to be able to walk. Her seizures got under control, but she had pretty severe mental retardation. There's nothing I'm ever going to do. They've actually subsequently moved to Pittsburgh, but at 2.5, her sister was completely normally developing, right? There is nothing more important than prevention. It is the entire basis of newborn screening. And honestly, if you are looking at what is going to get, I think this has come up a couple times. Why are they going to pay $1 million? We have some of these drugs, $1 million. $1 million to get some of these gene therapy drugs that are coming to the market. Enzyme replacement therapy, which I do routinely, costs $500,000 a year easily. Why do insurance companies pay for this? Because it sounds a little crazy, right? It's because the cost of care over that child's lifetime is so much more. These kind of things that prevent these catastrophic things are easier to get through for approval. They're easier to get paid. They're easier for me to get patients to take them, right? So Rett syndrome is one where there's a new drug on the market called Debut. It's that more incremental. It's kind of helping. It will do some little things, but it's not transformative, right? It isn't going to prevent the thing from happening. It isn't going to make the children. Rett is another one where kids are pretty severely involved in terms of seizures and heart issues and developmental issues. I'm having trouble getting, the parents had to fill out a form to get it back so I can prescribe it. And then we go through a bunch of other pre-authorizations and stuff like that. It takes me forever to get these forms back. Even the families aren't excited about it, right? So if you can prevent that outcome, if you can save that baby's brain, if you can do that, you're talking about saving 20, 30, 40, 50 years of healthcare expenses. I think it is so much what I will call the holy grail that we are actually working on fetal therapies now. Can we do it before anything happens?
Birth, yeah.
And actually, even some of the drugs we have, we're looking to repurpose can we start them in fetal life to prevent the fetal life neurodevelopmental problems that happen, slide them into then gene therapy when they get out. That's the holy grail of taking care of patients, especially with rare diseases.
You know, one of the things we're at an innovation summit here, and actually I'm on a National Academy panel now for identifying, the gaps in innovation, the gaps in resources that are really contributing to whether we are being able to innovate in areas of high unmet need and rare disease. Actually, not as much rare disease, but sort of disease burden. And one of the things that we're actually grappling with is defining innovation. And actually, I think in this panel, one of the things that we're hearing is that incremental. I mean, there could be a debate as to incremental improvement versus transformational change. I mean, should we wait for the transformational change, or should we actually take the single or double, as opposed to? And I'm actually looking at Matt shaking his head because I bet you have an answer to that.
Yeah, obviously the ideal for every patient would want a cure, but I think short of a cure, if the option is incremental or nothing, you would take incremental all day long. And I think we also learn. There's an interesting thing that happens if you look at rare disease drug development, and you'll find that there's many, many people pursuing spinal muscular atrophy. There's now many companies looking at Friedreich ataxia. There's many companies in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's not because the science tells us it's a lot easier to get a drug for these diseases. It's because there's a drug already approved for these diseases. And now there's a path, and then people can get smarter. Now there's the first one. Now we can think about how do we make a better one. So I think the incremental drugs, while not transformative, play a very important role in the overall space in terms of facilitating the better ones. Now, I think the appeal of gene therapy is this idea that it could be a cure, but I think even that is proving to not always be the case.
Yeah.
So I think we always shoot for transformative, but we'll take incremental because that's what's going to get us over time to better, more incremental, and maybe even to cures.
Yeah. Well, and I think the transformative conversation really was in the context of pricing and market value.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I do think that the system, whether it's CMS or commercial payers, whether it's at the federal or at the state level, is going to put pressure on adjusted quality of life years. And on the other hand, I mean, in looking at an epilepsy opportunity, for example, there are some that will say this will not be valuable unless you can reduce the seizure count to the point where someone can drive. Yeah. That may be something that, a commercial payer wants to see. But if you ask someone who's having 30 seizures a day and you can get them to 25 or 20, that could be really material.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I guess the other issue that we face in many of at least my companies and beyond is just the cost of evidence generation and really showing that you have something. In some cases, basically companies decide no can do because it's too big, too long, too costly. And that's another one of those things that I think we should tackle because that's actually a clinical regulatory issue that may be a gap.
It's a clinical regulatory, but it's also another positive to Lon's, maybe it's 4 on his list of reasons to invest in this space is here we do have patient advocacy and foundation groups that are really willing to participate, not just in helping to generate that data, but to fund the generation of that data.
That's great. Well, listen, I'm looking at the clock and I want to make sure that, that we have time for questions from the audience. So please feel free if anyone is interested.
We've got one in the middle there.
Good evening. This panel is very dear to me. My son was just diagnosed with MMA. He spent like a month and a half in Yale, and the geneticists at Yale are the reason why he's alive now. I also have an older son that has hemophilia and a nephew that has Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So this is very timely. I have 2 questions. The first question is, I saw in 2022, as it relates to hemophilia, they had a gene therapy cure. It was $3.5 million. Is there anything to tackle the cost of that? We can't afford that, but my son still has hemophilia. And secondly, this is more directed to Michelle. My son, probably about 4 or 5 days after he was born, he's 3 months now, he went into crisis. The newborn screening wasn't back yet. what is there anything in the? I hear the panel talking about prevention. Is there anything in the pipeline for getting that newborn screening back sooner? Because if we weren't attentive parents, he's doing well right now. Because we got him to the emergency room. He didn't, so far he's not showing any developmental delays or anything like that. Yale saved his life. But if the newborn screening had come back sooner, we would have been in a much better place. So those two things is two questions I have. Thanks.
Could we pass and ask for easier questions from somebody else?
I could do the pricing, at least have a stab at it. And thank you. It's incredible
for sharing.
Stories. And Michelle, yeah, in terms of pricing, it's been said already. If you look at what things cost, diseases cost over a lifetime, 3.5 million, over that lifetime doesn't seem too much. However, for payers that are having to come up with that at the time, and at the time not knowing if it's really going to work for lifetime, that's where the difficulty is. So I really think it's a societal issue that we have to overcome and find ways of being able to pay for those, really necessary treatments, having some, whether it's guarantees or some annuity people have spoken about over the lifetime to do it. But otherwise, it's going to be devilishly difficult. Again, as a society, once a day or once a week treatments, we kind of pay a lot of money for, but know what that is. For things like gene therapy, that's a one-off. One last thing from a company perspective, the great thing is to get a return on your investment so that you can keep doing other research. And that's why I could always easily live with the prices that we had at Alexion, because I knew how much of that investment was coming back for us to be able to develop other medicines. Does that make sense?
One of the things that is critical in rare disease and across all, treatments, therapeutics is access, right? And you can do a wonderful job of developing a drug, but if people don't get it, it's really wasted. It's wasted effort.
Yes.
And I think what we have to do as a society, building upon what Martin is saying, there are some people who are trying to be very creative in the way that we can finance these cases. Some of these cases are exceptionally costly. And someone, it may not be you, but someone else might have a Cadillac type plan. Someone may not. Are there some, exceptional cases and mechanisms that the government can put in place? There are researchers in terms of economists who are trying to come up with truly novel strategies for pools of capital, pools of funding that can at least address these issue of access. But, I think it also gets back to this notion of where are the incentives? If we don't have the incentives to drive the innovation in this arena like anything else, the capital will dry up. If the capital dries up, your son or someone else's daughter won't have any hope in the future. So we have to reach some sort of a conclusion. And this is a big problem. You're not alone.
Yeah. So first, I'd like to thank you for sharing your story with us. I think that is, I think these are important for people to be able to put faces with the work that we're doing and kind of address both questions. One, there are ways to get very expensive drugs paid for. And I think that I spend probably about 10% of my time just writing prior authorization letters, fighting with insurance companies. A $3.5 million is not going to happen on the first, probably, or second or third letter I write. But ultimately, I think there are ways of actually doing this to show that it's cost effective, particularly in a drug like hemophilia. If you're getting recurrent factor concentrations, if you're getting admissions, if you're getting, surgeries for complication of hemarthrosis, you can make those arguments. So I'd be happy to chat with you off at a separate time about how you could partner with the doctors he has to do that. But I think the second thing about the newborn screen, so I'll tell you some of my other hats that I wear. So I am also the chair of the RDAC, the Rare Disease Advisory Council for Connecticut. We are newly formed, and one of our jobs is to actually figure out what the rare disease community is and work on things to get better. So I agree. If by 5 days of life, MMA should have been picked up and called out, how that was set through. And I'm actually the medical director for metabolic medicine newborn screening for Yale, so I will actually personally look into that and figure out why it wasn't back, because it should have. Connecticut actually has a pretty fast turnaround time. I was at Duke for 10 years before I came to Yale, and the North Carolina's turnaround time is slower. The reason it's not that the test takes that long. So like MMA is diagnosed by an elevated C3 on acylcarnitine profile. That test takes about 6 to 8 hours to run. So the logistics of why that is there, it has to do with when it was taken, when it gets mailed, when it's received at the newborn screening lab, and then how quickly it is processed. And so those are mechanisms I think that every time these are rare diseases, every time we have that, we need to, like, these things need to come back to someone like me who can go back and look at the system, because I will tell you, the people who run our newborn screening lab in Connecticut are incredibly dedicated to, like everybody here, they're all dedicated to improving the lives of patients with rare diseases. So I think coming to these RDAC things, telling these stories can help with that. And again, I think this is also part of that process of, helping us get funding and stuff and resources to do this moving forward. As the more people can come out there and tell their stories and be advocates at that legislative level, which is why I took this position in the RDAC, we can help get your son's medication paid for and other people's sons, right, and daughters for things that are, not hemophilia, but also to get our times and our things down here. I think that together I'm going to say what I always end up saying, which is collaboration. The more we all work together as a team, knock down barriers of you work here, you do this, and look as a community, we're going to move the science and the care along.
I think you had a question.
Can I make a comment? Sorry, I'm over here.
Okay.
To follow up. There's actually a technology on the virtual platform for newborn screening, and what Kurt Schaaf actually needs is people like yourself as a parent and patient advocate, and people like Michelle to come together to really help build his case, because we've been struggling to get him funded for the last year or two as he's been trying to reiterate his story and make it a compelling business case. And we've really struggled. So Jen and I are sitting here going, we got to make this work for you guys and we need your help. So, but the technology is being developed. People are trying to, but we're trying to make a business case to actually be able to convert that.
Yeah, and Kurt's someone I know well and has very experienced in looking at his way of kind of doing rapid genome sequencing. So, in doing that in tandem with newborn screen, you get the genotype, phenotype, you know how aggressively to treat the patient, and it would actually reduce turnaround time.
It's worth just reflecting for.
Actually, please.
It's worth taking the next question. No, I was just going to reflect. It's so easy in the rare disease community to forget how much we have progressed and what we've got right now. If we were sitting here talking about Alzheimer's, we wouldn't have the test. Right? We wouldn't. We've got access to a lot of things. So the conversation has shifted in rare diseases, where we're not only sitting here talking about scientific obstacles, we're talking about societal, we're talking about financial, we're talking about access type things. That's new, but it means there are solutions, and they're much more proximal than they would be if we were talking about other things. Just worth noting.
Yes.
Please.
So I was wondering if you could comment on the FDA and Peter Marks's recent discussions around accelerated approval, particularly in using some of those surrogate endpoints to try to give people a faster pathway into sort of a commercial setting. Have you all had any experience in that? Have you seen the FDA's behavior actually change and actually begin to push forward programs that, in the old regime may have been slowed down?
So I can.
Do you want to?
We have a therapy right now under review by Peter Marks under accelerated approval for gene therapy. But I can say I think what he's doing, so for those who don't know, the FDA has a pathway called accelerated approval, which sounds exactly what it means, exactly what it sounds like. A drug can get approved sooner, not based on having the extensive evidence that it has clinical effects, but that maybe it moves a marker in your blood, a biomarker that would likely suggest over time there'd be clinical benefit. And what the FDA is able to do is approve the drug based on that biomarker while you go and collect that longer term evidence that it truly shows clinical benefit. And the FDA has had the power to do that all along. for many years. I think what Peter Marks is doing in CBER is really leveraging it to say, look, and he deserves a lot of credit. He said, look, if we continue to make it impossible to get sophisticated therapies like gene therapies forward, which is what was going on at FDA 2, 3, 4 years ago, no one will develop gene therapies anymore. And he was absolutely right, because what was happening was getting so hard to get even a gene therapy clinical trial done because they were looking for perfect in sort of an extreme way. And he said, no, we can't do this. We have to look at a way to facilitate getting things forward. Of course, things have to be safe, but we also have to use flexibility and say, what information do we need now? Yes. What can we get while a therapy is being studied and even after one's approved? So that's great. On the other side of FDA, it's CDER, which is where small molecules or pills would go. They have shown some willingness. I think historically the oncology division has used accelerated approval slightly differently by saying, okay, if you show some clinical benefit, we'll approve you, waiting for longer term benefit like overall survival.
The classical example has been tumor shrinkage as a proxy for survival benefit for anti-cancer drugs.
Yeah, and you're seeing that doing in neurology now. There's been a lot of discussion around ALS and Alzheimer's. So I think it's a very important step forward. And I think it was what I was referring to when I said that there's more regulatory flexibility now than I think there's been in the past, with the agency looking at ways to get therapies forward, especially where there's such a significant unmet medical.
Yeah, the FDA is profoundly committed to neurodegeneration and orphan rare disease. And they, in partnership with the NIH and the Foundation for NIH, have been working on validating biomarkers that could be proxies. So amyloid for Alzheimer's is a great example. There's a huge initiative now in ALS. They're looking at a number of rare diseases for that biomarker as a surrogate proxy for long-term disease benefit to help accelerate approvals. And then the other really important thing that Matt alluded to was when a gene therapy is brought forward to first-in-human trials, there's extensive preclinical animal toxicology and good manufacturing development that's done. And there's the vector that carries the gene of interest and the gene. And previously, the approach had been that every single full construct had to undergo the entire complex toxicology and manufacturing validation before you could do your first-in-human studies. And Peter Marks and Robert Califf have been really committed to seeing how can we accelerate that pathway by letting you do that complete package for your first gene of interest. But then if the vector is still completely the same, manufactured in the same, protocols or same system, you could leverage a lot of that, 90% of it, and go more quickly into the next indication. And that's critical, obviously, for rare disease, which have been the first indications pursued.
I'd like to take one very quick 1 minute postscript as moderator, discretion. And that is, there was a blow up, as you might have heard about in the ALS space in connection with Relyvrio and Amylyx. And that was approved on an accelerated approval basis. There were people in the field that said proves that there shouldn't be a accelerated approval. But in point of fact, what happened was the drug was withdrawn based on the fact that there was a failed phase 3 trial, a confirmatory trial. So in a sense, what people are saying is the system is working and we should really promote greater access to accelerated approval because this is how it worked well. I know we're over time by a minute. I thank this really distinguished panel. I know I've enjoyed doing it, and I hope everyone came away thinking that this was a good use of time.
Thanks for having us.